When money dies, the world doesn't stop. Empires crumble, currencies vanish, and ordinary people awaken to find their savings turned to ash. Every government swears its money is safe. Every empire insists its promises will endure forever. And every time, history proves them wrong. From Rome to France, from the Confederacy to modern Lebanon, people have discovered their salaries meaningless, their bank accounts worthless, and their futures stolen by systems they trusted. Collapse isn't rare. Collapse is the rule. The real question isn't if financial systems fail. It's how you survive when they do. Money is not bedrock. It is trust. And trust can evaporate overnight. History is brutal, but also merciful if you listen. Every collapse leaves a trail of lessons, warnings, and patterns. And if you pay attention, you'll notice something crucial. The survivors weren't the ones who trusted most. They were the ones who doubted first. The Byzantine lesson. Take the Byzantine Empire, remembered as the eastern half of Rome that survived 1,000 years beyond the fall of the West. At its heart was the gold Solidus, a coin so reliable that merchants from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia accepted it without question. For centuries, it was the closest thing the medieval world had to a global reserve currency. But history has a cruel sense of irony. Rome had already taught its lesson with the silver denarius, debased repeatedly until it was little more than tin coated with silver. Yet centuries later, the Byzantines repeated the same error with gold. They began shaving the coin, mixing in cheaper metals, stretching purity thinner. At first, no one noticed. Then, trust cracked. The coin that had anchored Mediterranean trade became a piece of political fiction. Debasement destroyed credibility. The Byzantine economy lost the stability it had once relied on. Who survived? Not paper promises, not imperial decrees. Merchants who quietly hoarded real gold or land beyond imperial reach preserved their wealth while everyone else watched their money evaporate. Lesson 1. Governments cannot resist diluting their money. When they do, value always flees toward assets that cannot be counterfeited. The Black Death. Scarcity becomes power. Not every collapse comes from rulers. Sometimes disaster strikes out of nowhere. Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed nearly half of Europe's population. Cities emptied, villages disappeared, trade routes collapsed. Yet amid the horror, the economic reality was complex. When half the workforce disappears, labor becomes precious. Survivors could demand higher wages. Food and land, once scarce, became relatively abundant. Families with silver, goods, or simply the ability to work suddenly held leverage they'd never imagined. Land that once cost a fortune could be bought for a fraction. Houses were abandoned. Fields went unplowed. Survivors were in a buyer's market. If that sounds familiar, it should. During the COVID-19 pandemic, supply chains broke, governments printed trillions, and inequality surged. Those with liquidity acquired assets, property, stocks, businesses, while those living paycheck to paycheck fell further behind. Pandemics redistribute wealth. They always have. Survivors of the Black Death climbed the social ladder. Survivors of COVID with liquidity did the same in the modern world. Crisis rewards preparedness. It punishes dependency. Florence. Too big to fail is a lie. In the 1340s, Florence was Europe's financial capital. Powerful banking families like the Bardi and Peruzzi had lent heavily to kings, most disastrously to Edward III of England. When Edward defaulted on massive loans, the banks collapsed. Depositors were ruined. Trade froze. Florence plunged into chaos. The citizens learned a harsh truth. Too big to fail is a myth. Institutions exist to profit, not to protect your savings. From Florence to Lehman Brothers in 2008 to Lebanon's banks freezing accounts in 2019, the pattern repeats. An institution's promises are only valid until the day they aren't. The Civil War, when paper fails. The American Civil War wasn't just fought on battlefields. It was fought in printing presses. Both the Union and the Confederacy printed paper money to fund the war. The Union issued greenbacks, backed not by gold, but by the promise of the United States itself. At first, they seemed patriotic and bold, but inflation eroded their value. The Confederacy's graybacks were even worse. By war's end, prices had risen thousands of percent. Soldiers' paychecks were worthless before they could spend them. Families carried sacks of bills that could barely buy a loaf of bread. In this collapse, paper promised nothing. Hard assets, land, food, gold, held real value. For the ordinary Southerner, it was ruin. For opportunists, it was a chance to seize wealth at fire sale prices. Lesson: your country has lived through currency collapse. Protection never comes from paper. It comes from real, tangible assets. Revolutionary France, when promises fail. In the 1790s, French revolutionaries toppled the monarchy and issued assignats, paper currency supposedly backed by confiscated property. But they printed too freely. Each new note diluted the last. Prices soared, wages lagged. The assignats became worthless. Farmers refused to sell food for paper, demanding silver or goods instead. Bread riots erupted in Paris. Once again, the winners were those holding real value: food, gold, property, things governments cannot print. Asia, debt and collapse. In 1997, Thailand's currency collapse spiraled into a regional crisis. Thailand had borrowed heavily in dollars, confident the peg would hold. When it failed, debts became unpayable overnight. Investors fled, economies shrank, millions lost jobs. Ordinary citizens suffered most. Those holding dollars or foreign assets survived. Those trusting local currency did not. Lesson: debt in someone else's money is a death trap. When storms hit, it is the debtor who drowns, not the creditor. Lebanon, the modern warning. Between 2019 and 2021, the Lebanese banks locked their doors. Depositors could not withdraw money. The Lebanese pound lost over 90% of its value. Middle-class families, retirees, engineers, all wiped out. Your money in a bank is not a treasure. It's a loan, and the lender can refuse repayment in a crisis. Those who survived had diversified assets abroad, real gold, property, or cash outside the banking system. Everyone else was trapped. Even in 2008, trillions were printed to bail out banks, inflating assets for the wealthy while wages stagnated. 2023 reminded us again, too big to fail is a fairy tale. So what actually survives? How do you protect yourself when the system collapses? History shows no single answer. Byzantium, gold. Black Death, liquidity to buy land. Florence, skepticism toward banks. Confederacy, hard goods. France, food and property. Asia, avoiding foreign currency debt. Lebanon, acting before the banks closed. Patterns shift, but the theme remains. Survival comes from understanding what holds real value when illusions crumble. Collapse is tragedy, but also opportunity. After the Black Death, peasants became landowners. After 2008, cash buyers scooped up foreclosed homes. History teaches that protection isn't just defense. It's positioning yourself to acquire value that others are forced to give up. Skills matter as much as assets. True wealth isn't just what you own, it's what you can do. The survivors of history weren't just rich, they created value when others could not. Bakers who provided bread, craftsmen who repaired tools, farmers who fed communities, merchants who moved goods across borders. In every crisis, money loses meaning. Production never does. Those who meet real needs are never poor for long. Real protection is assets plus skills plus awareness. The timeless pattern. Every crisis is a transfer, from the many who trusted to the few who prepared, from paper promises to tangible value, from passive savers to active builders. History doesn't repeat, but ignoring it can crush you. The question isn't whether collapse comes. It always does. The question is whether you'll be left holding promises or holding something real. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.